Gretchen Harrington left her Marple Township, Pennsylvania home shortly after 9 a.m. on Friday, August 15th, 1975. Now, for the past week, the 8-year-old had been attending a Bible school program at the Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church, located just a few blocks away from her house. Although one of her older sisters would usually escort her to church, on this particular day, Gretchen was by herself. Several witnesses will later recall seeing the little girl as she made her way towards Trinity Chapel, but she never arrived. At some point during the 10-minute walk, Gretchen vanished. It was around 11 a.m. when Gretchen's parents learned that she hadn't made it to Trinity Chapel, and they immediately called the Marple Township Police Department and reported her missing. Due to Gretchen's young age, police treated the case seriously from the start. Within a few hours, there were more than 300 volunteers combing through the neighborhood and looking for signs of the missing child. Gretchen's house and Trinity Chapel were both located on Lawrence Road, a heavily trafficked 4-lane highway. To get to the church, Gretchen would normally walk 2 blocks up a steep hill and then across to the opposite side of Lawrence Road. Along the way, she would pass a supermarket and a townhouse development. A neighbor recalled seeing Gretchen walking up the hill around 9:25 a.m., shortly after she left home, but her trail went cold after that. On Saturday morning, more than 400 volunteers turned up to help in the search for Gretchen, and they scoured the thick woods surrounding the grocery store and housing developments, hoping to find some clue as to Gretchen's whereabouts. And progress was slow, as the underbrush was nearly 2 feet thick in some parts of the woods. And still, by the end of the day, the searchers had managed to cover more than 5 square miles of rough terrain. Unfortunately, they didn't find anything that led them closer to finding Gretchen. Tracking dogs were able to follow Gretchen's scent from her home to about halfway up the steep hill along Lawrence Road, where her trail abruptly ended. Although they found nothing to indicate that any sort of struggle had taken place, investigators believe that Gretchen had gotten into a vehicle at that point. Now, the community rallied around Gretchen's parents. Her father, Reverend Harold Harrington, was the minister of the Reformed Presbyterian Covenant Church in Marple Township. Her mother, Enna, stayed home with the couple's 4 daughters. Although the Harringtons were somewhat strict with their children, they weren't allowed to watch television or play outside on Sundays. They were a close-knit family, happy with no known enemies. Gretchen was known for being shy around strangers, but she was friendly and outgoing with people she knew. She had a wide circle of friends that included classmates from the private school she attended, as well as neighbors who attended the local public school. Friends described her as being a bit of a tomboy. She was very athletic and loved to play basketball, baseball, and kickball. Gretchen became a big sister just 8 days before she went missing. Although she had joked about running away from home if her new sibling turned out to be a girl, she had 2 older sisters and she longed for a brother. So it was love at first sight when she met her baby sister, and she was excited about her new role. Harold and Enna told investigators that they were certain Gretchen would not have gotten into a car with a stranger. They had raised all of their daughters to be wary around people they didn't know. And Gretchen in particular shied away from speaking with anyone unfamiliar to her. Now, detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and handing out flyers with Gretchen's picture. They created a 24-hour hotline and urged people to call with any information they might have about the case. More than 200 people called in the first few days after Gretchen vanished. and investigators followed up on each potential lead. Unfortunately, none of the information provided a lead to her recovery. 2 weeks into the investigation, detectives were no closer to finding Gretchen. Although they had initially believed she might have been kidnapped, as time passed without any ransom demands, investigators admitted that Gretchen had likely been a victim of foul play. They expanded their search, distributing missing flyers throughout Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. Several potential sightings of Gretchen were called into the hotline, but investigators were unable to confirm any of them. A truck driver who had been driving down Lawrence Road on that day that Gretchen went missing called the police and reported seeing a girl matching Gretchen's description walking near a green pickup truck that was parked about halfway up the hill leading to Trinity Chapel. He recalled that there had been a male in the driver's seat of the truck, but he was unable to provide police with a description of the man. He noted that the truck appeared to be very old and in poor shape with a missing tailgate. A woman reported seeing a male leading a small child towards a white compact car that was parked on Lawrence Road, while another witness recalled seeing a white male, possibly in his teens, and a small child running towards a white 4-door car. Despite their best efforts, investigators were never able to identify any of these vehicles or drivers. It's unclear if any of them were involved in Gretchen's disappearance. By the end of September, tips had stopped coming in and the case was starting to grow cold. Although detectives had identified several potential persons of interest, they were unable to connect any of them to Gretchen's disappearance. Investigators were frustrated with the lack of viable leads and admitted that they had no idea what had happened to the missing girl. In desperation, one of the detectives consulted a psychic to see if she could provide useful information. The psychic stated that Gretchen was deceased, but was unable to pinpoint where her body might be found. The search for Gretchen came to a heartbreaking end on October 14, 1975, when a sailor from the Philadelphia Naval Yard stumbled across human remains while jogging through Ridley Creek State Park in Delaware County. Although the remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, investigators were certain that they belonged to Gretchen due to the clothing found at the scene. Dental records confirmed the identification. An autopsy determined that Gretchen had died from a blow to her head that had fractured her skull. Due to the state of her remains, the coroner was unable to determine if Gretchen had been sexually assaulted, but investigators believe it was likely a possibility. Her killer had undressed her and laid her clothing in a neat pile next to her body, and her underwear had been draped over a tree branch. The fact that Gretchen's body had been found in a state park brought the Pennsylvania State Police into the investigation. Officials noted that Gretchen would have been unable to get to the park on her own. It was 7 miles away from her home, so they assumed she had been abducted. They believe that she had most likely been killed in the spot where her body was discovered. State troopers spent several days scouring the park with metal detectors, hoping to find something that may lead them to Gretchen's killer. They interviewed dozens of people and interrogated sex offenders who lived in the area, but they were unable to develop any substantial leads. Some investigators believed that they had identified the person responsible, but they were unable to come up with any tangible evidence to back up their theory. Although the suspect's name had never been released, investigators stated that he was a convicted sex offender who was eventually sentenced to prison on unrelated charges. Not all the detectives were convinced that this man was involved in Gretchen's murder, although they continued to pursue other leads, tips, and eventually dried up and the case went cold. Gretchen's murder made headlines again in November 1983 after a Marple Township detective received an anonymous letter from someone claiming to have information about the case. The lead detective assigned to the case made a public appeal for the author of the letter to contact him with more details, but the person never came forward, and the case was once again placed on the cold case shelf, where it remained until today. It has been 48 years since the tragic abduction and murder of 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington in August of 1975 in Pennsylvania. Now, the case remained unsolved for decades, causing immense pain to her family and community. However, there has been a recent development in the case. The Delaware County District Attorney's Office in Pennsylvania announced that an arrest has been made in the decades-old unsolved case. The suspect, identified as 83-year-old David Zanstra of Marietta, Georgia, has been charged with multiple serious offenses, including criminal homicide of murder in the first, second, and third degree, as well as kidnapping a minor and possession of an instrument of crime. According to the information provided by the authorities, Gretchen was last seen on the morning of August 15, 1975, when she left her home to walk to a summer Bible camp program held at 2 local churches. Interestingly, David Zanstra was the pastor of one of these churches, and he was responsible for transporting children to the secondary church location after their morning activities. Gretchen's father, who was the pastor of the secondary church, reported her missing to the police when she failed to arrive at the church that day. An intensive manhunt was launched in the area, but tragically, the search for Gretchen came to an end 2 months later when her lifeless body was discovered by a jogger in the secluded area of Ridley Creek State Park. Now, the case remained cold until July 17, 2023, when investigators traveled to Marietta, Georgia to interview David Zanstra. Initially, he denied any involvement in Gretchen's disappearance, but investigators confronted him with evidence of sexual misconduct from his past, which had been provided by an individual in January of 2023. Faced with this evidence, Zanstra eventually admitted to seeing Gretchen walking alone on the road on the morning of her disappearance. According to Zanstra's confession, he offered Gretchen a ride and he took her to a nearby wooded area. There, he asked her to remove her clothing, but when she refused, he struck her in the head with his fist, causing her to bleed. Believing she was dead, he attempted to cover up her body, and he left the area. The announcement of the arrest brought hope and closure to the Harrington family, who had been grappling with the pain of losing their young daughter for almost half a century. Through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the family released a statement expressing their gratitude for the law enforcement's continuous efforts in seeking justice. David Zanstra is currently in custody in Georgia, but he has refused to waive extradition to Pennsylvania. The district attorney's office will submit a petition for requisition to bring him back to Pennsylvania to stand trial for the charges he is facing. To further investigate and determine if Zanstra may be linked to any other cases, a DNA sample was collected from him and will be compared to other open cases in Pennsylvania and potentially across the country. Authorities are urging anyone with any additional information about Zanstra's activities during this time in Texas and Georgia, where he lived after his time in Pennsylvania, to come forward. The arrest of David Zanstra is seen as a testament to the determination of law enforcement and the unwavering commitment to justice from Gretchen's family and the community. The closure brought about by this arrest is a reminder that even after many years have passed, justice still can be served, and those affected by such heinous crimes can find some solace and peace. Following his time in Pennsylvania, Zanstra moved to various locations including California, Texas, and finally Marietta, Georgia, where he was residing at the time of his arrest. May 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington finally rest in peace. Guys, leave your comments below. Mindful, you're respectful of the victims and the families. Make sure you like, subscribe, share the video, and click on the notifications. Peace.